Hi, everyone. We'll just give everyone a few minutes to join and then we'll get started. I would love to know too where folks are tuning in from. I am currently in the GM building in Manhattan, but would love to hear where others are listening in from. Oh, I'm from Texas, so Florida, BK. I'm from San Antonio, which whenever I say I'm from Texas, people guess every other major city in Texas before they get to San Antonio. But I do miss the Tex-Mex. Oh, so fun. I'm jealous. It's very hot. I do know that. My mom tells me. Okay, so we'll get started. All right, so thank you everyone for hopping on tonight and welcome to our She's Howard Own Your Power event. Today's event is Walking the Talk, how ELC is delivering on its ESG commitments. And this event is hosted by the Estee Lauder Companies in partnership with the Howard University Department of Alumni Relations. I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. My name is Emma Eatman. I am a manager for value chain communications on the global communications team. I am a Howard graduate. I graduated in 2019 and I studied public relations and political science. So I was in the School of Communications. And then I worked in DC doing political communications for the Biden administration for several years. And then I recently moved to New York and switched to beauty. So a big change, but loving my time here at ELC. I'm very excited to talk about all the great things we're doing in the ESG space. So today, as we hear from our speakers, we'll learn about some of the ways ELC is supporting the communities where we live, work, and source. You'll hear from employees who have placed social impact at the center of their careers and are helping ELC deliver on its commitment to support a healthy planet, advance social justice, and meet reporting and good governance regulations. So before we dive into today's topic, I do want to do a little bit of level setting. You may have heard of ESG, especially in the context of companies and global corporations, and it's obviously a very hot topic, especially in the media now. But simply put, ESG is a framework used to assess an organization's business practices and performance on various sustainability and ethical issues. And for context, it stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. The emphasis around sustainability has certainly grown in importance over the last decade, and it's become a critical decision-making component for companies, communities, and individuals. So I would love to hear from you guys. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not important at all and 10 being extremely important, how would you rate the importance of sustainability in your daily lives? And you can drop your answers in the chat. I would say for me too, as an answer to this question, it's probably around an 8. It could be more of a 10, I would say, but actually being from Texas, surprisingly, we talked a lot about climate change, especially as the summer months got hotter and hotter. So from that aspect, from a climate change perspective, it's pretty important. So an 8, very good. A lot of 8s, 7. Wonderful. Yeah, Tanya, I work so closely with the EHS team, so definitely she is an essential part of that work. Great. And so we'll hear more about this from our panelists, but for context, at ELC, the Global Corporate Citizenship and Sustainability, or GCCS team, works alongside partners across the company to drive best practices for the company's environmental and social impact action, strategies, initiatives, and goals. GCCS helps the company strengthen our impact on the planet and the communities where we live, work, and source. At ELC, one of our largest social impact initiatives, which many of you have probably heard of, is our breast cancer awareness and prevention work. We also work with partners across our supply chain, which is something I focus a lot on, to ensure we're sourcing materials for our products and packaging them responsibly. And also, we've done a lot of work to support women's advancement and girls' education across the US and the globe. And you'll hear much more about this during our conversation. So now, finally, right before we get to our conversation, I think that is there a poll up now? Yes, there we go. So here's a question: on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 indicates a limiting understanding and 5 indicates a comprehensive understanding, how familiar do you feel you are with ELC's environmental, social, and governance initiatives? And I'll give you all a second to respond to that poll. Even though I work pretty closely in this space too, I feel like I'm only a 4. That's why I'm so excited for this conversation. Just give a couple more seconds. Okay, so we'll circle back to this question at the end to test your knowledge after the conversation. And finally, last piece of housekeeping, as you may know from previous events with She's Howard, we'll be giving away products from our favorite ELC brands. At the end of our panel, we'll do a Q&A to test your knowledge. So I encourage all of you to stay engaged during our conversation for that piece at the end. Okay, so let's get started. I want to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. I'm going to do these one by one. And so our first panelist for today is Shri Murthy, and she is our Senior Manager of ESG Reporting. Shri, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that intro. So yes, I am the Senior Manager of ESG Reporting at Estee Lauder. And so if you kind of think of E, S, and G, you can kind of, the G is governance, which is the side of the business that I'm focused on, which is focused on the reporting side of the business. So that really entails leading our reporting across all of our social impact and environmental initiatives, and communicating all the great work that we do to our external stakeholders through our annual publication of our ELC's Social Impact and Sustainability Report. So I work very closely with several different partners across our company to help develop the narrative of our reporting. And we also closely monitor regulations and voluntary standards to make sure we're reporting on everything that is required of us, as well as reporting on everything that our investors, consumers, and other external stakeholders expect us to report on.
Great, thank you, Shri. And our next panelist is Rachel Sherman. She's our Executive Director of Sustainability. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. I'm on our sustainability team. I lead our Planet Pillar, which is our climate strategy, as well as all of the work we do on environment in our stores. So if you go into a MAC makeup store, or if you buy La Mer at a counter in Macy's, we work on sustainability like LED lighting or different construction materials in those spaces. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Rachel. And last but not least, we have Esha Hill. She's our manager of equity and philanthropic partnerships.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight. As Emma said, my name is Esha Hill. It's like Kesha without the K, if that's helpful for anyone on the call. And before just giving a little bit of background about what I do, I wanted to mention that while I'm not a Howard grad, my grandfather was the dean of the pharmacy school for many years. And so my family and I have always held the school and its alum in such high regard. So I'm very excited to be here today and carry on his legacy in some small portion. But as Emma said, I am a manager at ELC for our philanthropic partnerships. I manage our racial equity partnerships for our charitable foundation and also support some of our equity initiatives through our corporate funding. And I can provide more details on that as we get into the conversation, but very excited to be here.
Thank you, Esha. And I would consider you pretty close to an alum if he was a dean of the school. So thank you all for those introductions. So we're going to kick off the conversation now. So today we're going to start by having each panelist give a brief overview of how ELC approaches their different pillars of E, S, and G. We heard a little bit about that, but we're going to dive into it. And before we start, I want to hear from each of our speakers, if we can, about how they ended up in the beauty industry. There are so many career paths, as you've heard. So what was your path to the industry / ELC? And if you can, tell us the moment that you knew you wanted to work in sustainability or social impact work. So I'll start with Shri, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So I might have the least traditional route to my current role. So I actually worked in finance straight out of school, and I worked at several different banks, including Morgan Stanley, UBS, and Lehman Brothers, but made a very hard pivot into the sustainability world. So as much as I love the finance world, and I always had this very strong interest in social impact and sustainability, and I was working in finance for 10 years. And I guess on a personal note, it wasn't until I had my daughter that it made me reevaluate what I wanted to do professionally. And I basically kind of thought to myself, if I'm going to be spending so much time away from my kid, I better really love what I'm doing. And it was kind of a light bulb that went off in my head and made me decide that I should be spending more time in a field that I was more passionate about. And so I left my career in finance. I went back to school to get my master's in sustainability, in some way to kind of add to, validity to my resume in terms of my expertise in this new field. And luckily through the network, through my grad program, was able to get an internship at G3 Apparel Company, and then subsequently a role at Estee Lauder after I graduated. So I've loved it here ever since.
Love that. Thank you, Shri. As someone who went from politics to beauty, I definitely appreciate non-traditional pathways. Asha, do you want to speak a little bit about your journey?
Sure. So similar to Shri, I kind of have a varied background. During college, I was a government and politics major with a minor in French and global poverty. And so I've always been very interested in, international affairs, social impact. I thought I wanted to work for the UN. That didn't pan out. I ended up going to graduate school right after undergrad and received a degree in human rights. And from that, I worked in DC for several years, supporting an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a bipartisan organization that gives grants to civil society leaders from emerging democracies around the world. And I worked in their fellowships department. And so we welcome different activists, scholars, journalists, to come to DC for 6-month fellowships and learn about democracy from each other, meet with different people in DC. And a whole pillar of that work is supporting what we called activists at risk. And those are people who were escaping political persecution in their countries for their views and for their activism. And so because of the work that I was doing through the National Endowment for Democracy, I realized I really wanted some more on the ground experience, whatever that means. And so I went to support one of our partners for 6 months along the Thai-Burmese border, a partner that was working with former political prisoners and advocating for the release of all political prisoners in Burma, which I know this sounds like very not connected to the beauty industry, but it all makes sense. So just give me a minute and bear with me. And so while I was there, I really realized just like the value of communications and the value of making sure that different audiences could hear what an organization is saying, because while the organization I was working for in Myanmar was doing really great work, they were actually just speaking into a silo. They were talking to people who already knew a lot of the good work that they were doing. And so that really led me to want to work in communications, actually. So I found a job in New York about, I guess, like now 5.5 years ago that was supporting it was a consulting job that was working with communications for global health organizations. And so I did that for about 4.5 years through the pandemic, realized that it wasn't just communications that made a difference, but also money. And so that made me want to work in philanthropy so I could really make a difference and give money to groups and organizations that were doing really good work that I was passionate about. And so I started looking for jobs in that area, connecting a lot of different things that I was interested in: racial equity, health equity, philanthropy, working in the US space rather than the global space. And that really led me to ELC. And so while the beauty part of it isn't necessarily through the career part of my journey, I definitely have always been really interested in social impact for brands and really making sure that we're connecting across audiences and really bringing people in to important messages who might not traditionally be interested in them. So that's kind of how I found my job here.
Love that. Very exciting, interesting journeys to listen to thus far. Now, Rachel, can you talk a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Hard to follow that. Such a cool background.
No pressure, but
yeah, I know. And so I love sustainability because everyone has such different paths. And I think that's what makes it such a fun and interesting space to work in. Mine was also different from both Shri and Esha. I'm originally from Canada, so I was going to school in Vancouver. I majored in Asian studies, focusing on Chinese, and I moved to Beijing when I was in my second year of college. And when I was in Vancouver, I was working with the World Wildlife Fund on illegal wildlife trade, especially between Asia and North America. And when I went to Beijing to study Chinese, I really felt the impacts of our consumption decisions and environmental impacts. In Canada, it was always kind of theoretical, and in China, you feel the impacts here this year. But prior to this year, I hadn't experienced days where you couldn't see the sun because of wildfires or pollution or things like that. So that really impacted me, and I was passionate about working to make a difference in that space, especially the things that we produce in China but consume in North America, and how can you make an impact on those supply chains. So I went to graduate school in DC at GW, unfortunately not at your school, but neighbors. And I did an MBA and a degree in international relations. I was working with looking at supply chains, and we worked with Chinese factory owners to talk to them about what it means when an international brand comes to them and asks them to do something on sustainability. What's their reality? What challenges did they face? Things like that. So I wanted to work at a multinational, and I ended up, through connections through school, alumni connections, I took a consulting role at McDonald's Corporation. So I moved up to Chicago. I worked with McDonald's for 8 years. And then I wanted to move industries. I loved working in agriculture and in restaurants, food and beverage, but I was passionate about working in beauty and learning more, and being at a New York-based company that also is the majority of our workforce is women. So I was really excited to work at a place where I get to work with so many amazing women. So that's my path.
Okay, a lot of heavy hitters on the call tonight. So this is exciting. Thank you all for sharing your stories. So now I want to get a little bit deeper into the topics. You guys have spoken so much about your work and your path here. So I want to ask, how does ELC's approach to sustainability, social investments, and good governance make it a differentiator? We can go through the same path we've been going. Shri, if you have anything, but kind of a free for all if any of you have an answer to that.
Do you want to go, Shri? Go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
I was going to say the thing that stands out to me at ELC is that how integrated sustainability and philanthropy is into our business model. So our chief sustainability officer, she reports into our chairman from the Lauder family, as well as our CEO, and we're a standalone department. So we don't report into communications or legal or some other function in the business. We have, direct reporting lines to our executives, and we do an annual strategy, which I hadn't experienced before coming to ELC, and it's our business strategy. Sustainability is one of the pillars of that business strategy. So I think having it integrated in that way is unique and really helps it stand out at the company. Over to you, Shri.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I think from my experience of working at different companies and seeing how ESG is handled, the biggest thing is that the messaging and the commitment to ESG at Estee Lauder comes from top down. And so it's a huge win, because rather than spending most of our day trying to convince our top management that this is important, they're the ones telling us it's important, and our job is just to execute and make it happen. So that's one of the biggest differentiators that I've seen at Estee Lauder. Also, the size of our team is quite large, and it just shows our commitment to this space. I don't think I've ever seen another company with so many people dedicated to this space. And really, as you see different companies and you learn about ESG and where it sits, you really get understanding for the company's commitment. So I've seen it where ESG sits in the legal department. And so really that company is only looking at it from a risk standpoint. How could this potentially negatively impact us? Other groups it sits in admin, and it's more of like a check the box activity. In other companies, you'll see it sitting within comms, and it's more of a communication strategy, and just like how can we discuss our topics without actually necessarily having a strong team committed to this. So I just think it's different at ELC, because you really do see this massive team dedicated to it, and it's so integrated. And I think even sitting in my seat, I touch so many different parts of our organization, so we're very comprehensive in terms of our approach to it. So I think it's definitely been a very exciting place to be and learn more from.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And even from where I sit on value chain communications, working whenever we work with our supply chain executives and their teams, sustainability is always the first thing we discuss. How can we do from packaging to sourcing? How are we doing this in a sustainable way? And so definitely, I 100% agree. It's very ingrained. Rachel, I want to circle back to you. I know that you work particularly on our planet pillar from our sustainability work. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the exciting initiatives that ELC and our brands are spearheading to decrease our carbon footprint, since we know that's such an important topic today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really exciting space, and we're doing a lot as a company. So we have targets on climate action. We have something called science-based targets, which means that we've looked at our responsibility in terms of the size of our company and what we need to do to reduce our emissions that would be aligned with climate science. So aligned with the commitments of the Paris Agreement, which is great, because we know we're doing enough if we achieve these targets, and then we're bringing along so many people in our ecosystem, our suppliers and so on. So some of the tangible things we're actually doing, we actually met one of our targets early, several years early. So that's the target that covers the things that we own and operate. So those are the areas we have the most direct control of. That's the places where we produce product, our manufacturing facilities, the places where we hold those products, our distribution centers. And we're doing things like putting solar on the roof of those buildings so that we're generating renewable energy. We're also investing in large scale renewable energy. So we have a wind VPPA, which is a purchasing agreement in Oklahoma, and that covers actually our entire footprint for North America. So it's a large, important investment. And then most of our footprint actually sits in scope 3, which is the area outside of our control. And we're doing things like engaging our suppliers there, training them on what it looks like to do climate work and doing it with them instead of dictating to them what they need to do. So we're sharing resources with them, we're learning from them, and then kind of creating the path together. And we have work streams that cover everything we do as a business. So we have work in packaging, we have work in the raw materials that go into any of our makeup, skincare, hair care products, the travel that we do as employees. It's very holistic and we have lots to do, but we've also accomplished a lot.
Sounds like it. And I know Tanya asked specifically what we're doing from a packaging standpoint. Rachel, do you
Okay.
have
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, it's nice because before we really ramped up things on climate, we had existing packaging goals around what we call the 5 R's. So making sure things have post-consumer recycled content, that the packaging is recyclable itself, and so on. I don't know if I'm freezing a bit. What we're doing is we're measuring the climate impacts of that packaging work we're doing. So if you're buying forest stewardship certified materials, it has a lower carbon footprint. Also, if you're producing less packaging because you have a refill program, for example, you'll have a lower carbon footprint. So what's nice about the company is that we have many brands and each brand is innovating in a different way. So for example, Aveda has been using 100% post-consumer recycled packaging for several years. And other fragrance companies like Killian, for example, brands have been offering refills since they existed as a company. So there's a lot that we learn between the different brands as well.
Very exciting. Thank you, Rachel, for discussing that. I want to move on to Esha and hear a little bit more about the social impact side. So what social issues are ELC most engaged in, and how does ELC work with our partners in these areas, either from a philanthropic angle or an equity angle?
Yeah, definitely. So our social impact partnerships span both like our foundation, our charitable foundation, and our corporate giving. And so one really great example of how those two work together is actually in our breast cancer work. And that's also one of our biggest social investments and somewhere where we are very engaged. So just for some background, history, and context, in 1992, Evelyn Lauder actually co-created the pink ribbon that is now, synonymous with breast cancer awareness, and launched the Estee Lauder breast cancer campaign. And so that really inspired this movement around ending breast cancer for all. And so since then, ELC, through both our charitable foundation and through the campaign, we've donated, I think it's around 118 million globally in life-saving research, education, medical services. And then we are the largest corporate funder for the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. And we've donated a large chunk of money to that organization as well. And so I mentioned the Breast Cancer Research Foundation because it is also a foundation grantee. And in our most recent support to them, we've made this pretty large commitment over 5 years to fund groundbreaking research to reduce breast cancer disparities and improve outcomes for Black women in the US. And so this is like a really good example of how we are working across the business, across the enterprise. We are folding equity into all of the work that we're doing. And then we're continuing along the legacy that Evelyn Lauder set out in the 90s. And so the research is actually going to look at breast cancer access to care. It's going to look at social determinants of health. While it's focused on Black women in the US, the hope is that a lot of this research will also be able to be applied globally. And obviously, this is going to have a huge impact for women in the US and across the globe. And so the other thing that I will just say is through all of our social impact initiatives, and clearly this is one, we try to keep women and girls at the center, regardless of if it's our support for breast cancer, if it's responsible sourcing along our supply chains, education, career readiness. Women and girls is really the heart and soul of a lot of our social impact initiatives.
That's amazing. It's just hearing the both of you speak to the different pillars of ESG. It goes to show like how important keeping ESG at the forefront is for companies, because it spans essentially everything that they do. And so thank you both for speaking to your work. And so finally, for the G section of ESG, Shri, can you speak to how our reporting at ELC for our ESG work has evolved over the years?
Yes. So we report on an annual basis, and we report on everything we deem a priority issue for our company. So obviously priorities differ from company to company based on the industry that they're in and whatnot. So we really start off each reporting cycle by analyzing, what is important to Estee Lauder internally, and then what is important to our external stakeholders like investors, consumers, regulators. And we try to make sure we find that overlap between those two to really identify what topics we should be reporting on. So this is across our social impact and our environmental initiatives throughout all of our brands, regions, and channels. So, this is really how our reporting has changed over time. It's exactly that, which topics do we report on? For example, we're always monitoring new topics that are becoming more important in the public eye, like recently nature and biodiversity, plastics, and we adjust our reporting to make sure that we're accounting for what our stakeholders expect of us, and what our internal strategy is as well. So our goal is to, not only be transparent on our reporting, but also report on what people actually care about.
Yeah. And do you, we talked earlier about how sustainability has become more of a hot topic, both from a media standpoint and of course from a reporting standpoint. So have you, in the time you've been at ELC, have you seen more of an urgency with, either answering to investors or answering to consumers on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually are very close. We work very closely with our investor relations team, and we've actually become integral. And so we have a member from our team who sits on a lot of these investor calls, and we actually track how many times ESG topics have come up as a question from investors. And over the years, I think when we started tracking this, I think we had about 4 inquiries a year, and this is back in 2018. And now we have close to 70 to 80 requests, questions that come up throughout the year. So we've definitely seen this exponential growth in questions that we get from our investors. And like I said, investors are only one part of our stakeholders that we look at: consumers, regulations, voluntary standards. These are all different pieces that we're constantly looking at, reevaluating, and making sure we're meeting the standards.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And obviously, ELC is a global company. So from a regulation standpoint, we have a lot to consider. So thanks for sharing, Shri. Asha, I want to go back to you. I want to ask, how has ELC's charitable foundation evolved and expanded its mandate over time, to the point Shri was saying about how our reporting has expanded? How has our charitable work expanded, and where do you see it heading over the next several years?
Yeah, definitely. So ELC launched its charitable foundation in 2016. And when it launched the charitable foundation, it was very much focused on girls' education and providing access to girls' education around the world. And so, as I said, women and girls are really at the center of all the work we do. However, we really have expanded our mandate since then. And so our mission really is to improve the well-being of our diverse global communities with equity at the center, with an emphasis on women and girls. And so we do this through our 3 pillars. So the first one is girls' education and women's advancement. So this really focuses on partners that are supporting secondary education efforts, supporting college and career readiness, career advancement, upskilling. One area where we're really thinking through deepening our focus is supporting young women in STEM who have chosen to pursue STEM careers. And then our second pillar is our communities pillar, and this is communities where we live, work, and source. And so a lot of the work that Rachel has talked about actually sits kind of nicely with that pillar. So some of our responsible sourcing work, environmental biodiversity, and Rachel and the women who manage this pillar actually are always in constant conversation, talking about new partnerships, new things that we could do to help align the pillar with the business, et cetera. And then the last pillar that we have is our racial equity pillar. And so that's the one that I manage. And this pillar was really born out of some of the public commitments that we made as a company in 2020 after George Floyd, to provide $10 million in funding to external organizations that were supporting racial and social justice advancement in the US. And so we've since that time met and exceeded that goal. And so we've also folded equity, racial equity, into its own pillar in the foundation, and really taken a look at all of our different partnerships with an eye towards equity, and making sure that we're supporting the communities that are closest to the work. And so a lot of our funding for our equity initiatives are to really fund in our legacy areas, but with that equity focus. So in education and environment, women's advancement in careers, supporting BIPOC-led work in fields that lack BIPOC voices. So practically speaking, like we're working with a lot of HBCU students, we're providing access to education for BIPOC students, and then providing a platform and resources for some of our grassroots climate justice organizations that are led by women of color. So this is also the pillar where a lot of the BCRF funding sits, but the pillars are kind of fluid and flexible because we want to work holistically and not in a siloed fashion. But on top of those three pillars for the foundation, we also have a lot of our brands that are very engaged in social impact initiatives. Some have brand funds, and then others, give in a more one-off fashion. But I think nearly all of our brands are engaged in social impact in some way. And so that's something that we are really proud of as a company, because, the brands are the life and soul of our company, and they are really engaged and really, really want to support different initiatives as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Esha. And, to your point about the racial equity pillar, it's also evident through a lot of Rachel's work with Planet about how racial equity is woven through a lot of our sustainability work in terms of how, communities of color are most impacted by issues of climate change and the impacts of that. So very important. So thank you for your work in that area. So Shri, I wanted to ask you, since you've been at ELC, what is one of the most exciting projects you've helped launch at ELC?
So one of the most exciting projects I've been able to be a part of is launching and setting new goals for Estee Lauder. So we're constantly trying to set new commitments and goals, and I've been lucky enough to be part of the team that's kind of helped make this process more robust. And I know that might not sound that exciting, but here's why I think it's cool. I know, many people are probably familiar. I don't know how many people are familiar with the term greenwashing, but it's a term that's used to describe a company who makes claims or commitments around ESG efforts but don't necessarily provide supporting backup. And, like a company says, we're committed to saving the ocean. You're kind of left sitting there, saying, but how? So by being a part of a team that really puts structure around any claims or goals, it's a pretty great way to hold our company accountable. And, I know I said I made a huge pivot from finance to this world, but I've actually been able to leverage my finance background to make sure that the commitments that we make are the same. We treat them the same way like we do any financial goals, by saying, if we're going to say something like save the ocean, we're going to say save the ocean by cleaning up X number of pounds of trash every year for the next 5 years. Something, I mean, that's a bad example, but you know what I mean, in terms of giving our consumers confidence in us and not just spinning a story to make us sound more green than we actually are. We're actually putting metrics and targets around everything we commit to. So it really does make ourselves more accountable and more trustworthy to not only our investors, but more importantly, our consumers.
A really good point. From a consumer lens, yes, you definitely see a lot of brands that just say they're sustainable and you're like, okay, how, why? And then, you know, at least from a communication standpoint, because I sit on the communications team, I can definitely say the ELC's great at making sure that anything we say to reporters, to media or externally is backed by, you know, with whatever we're saying. So that's a really good point. And I've seen greenwashing in a lot of our clips. So thank you for speaking to that.
Yeah, and I'll say, Rachel probably can back me up here. We're more on the conservative side. We'll never say anything unless we have beyond, you know, supporting documentation to say that we can actually make this claim. So anytime you do see Estee Lauder come out with a commitment or a claim, know that it's gone through so much rigor, and it really is something that we're very committed to.
Yes, wonderful. And so, Rachel, I wanted to ask, what's the most interesting project you've worked on while being at ELC?
Yeah, I was thinking, just as we were talking, if people are interested in learning more about our climate work, we released last year our first ever climate transition plan. So if you Google that, you can actually look at a lot of detail about climate. So that's one thing I was excited for us to put out, just be more transparent. Right now, I'm really excited. I'm working on something called this Fragrance Leadership Collective. It's organized by someone who leads our innovation in fragrance as a category. And he brought together leaders from across the business, and they said, you know, what are the biggest priorities in perfume or fragrance for our company? And sustainability came up as one of the 3 priorities. And so I was brought into the team, and I love it because I get to work with people in roles that I didn't even know existed, never would have thought, and I learned so much from them. So we have someone who's an expert in scent and qualifying ingredients and making sure they're up to our high standards for perfumes. We have people who develop new perfumes around the world for all of our different brands, like Joe Malone or Kilian or Frederic Malle. And I learn a lot from them. We have consumer insights people, marketing people, and we're all working together on sustainability, which is, I think, what it takes to actually do it and integrate it into the business. So it's a specific example, but I get a lot from it, and thought I would share. Thanks.
That sounds very exciting. Thank you, Rachel. And I hear from all of you too, how integrated our brands are into all this work. You know, obviously we're a family of brands, but all of our brands are, of course, very singular and kind of do their own thing. But it's nice to hear that from a sustainability standpoint and an ESG commitment standpoint, that our brands are there on all fronts. So that's another proof point there. So thank you, Rachel. Well, thank you all for sharing these stories and perspectives around your professional career. I have a couple questions that have come through. The one that I have, and I think, Rachel, you can speak a lot to this, is I know Climate Week is coming up in September. We have UNGA and Climate Week. It's a very, very busy month, I guess, of September for ELC. So how do we activate around big social months like Climate Week, like Earth Month? I know we show up in a lot of ways there. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you do there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great timing. So it's coming up in 3 weeks. And the reason it exists is because of the UN General Assembly. So on the sidelines of the world's leaders being in New York at the UN, business comes together to talk about climate. And they're interrelated events because these topics are. And it's all about, you know, how business can support and get behind global climate agreements, and how we can be movers, you know, despite political issues or challenges. Business can be there to drive action on climate change. And it's nice because we join these events from a communications perspective, where we'll work with groups like yours, Emma, to go out and speak about the initiatives that we're doing in supply chain or in sustainability. We're platinum sponsors of this event specifically, and have been for a few years, which means our Chief Sustainability Officer will be speaking at the opening event. But we're also, so we're there from a communications perspective, but also from a practitioner perspective. So we have people who are working in this space, like everyone on the call and others, going to meet with other businesses, learn about ideas that are out there, see how we can catalyze change. So we're not just doing it alone, we're doing it together. And they're really great venues for that kind of work. And then we also will be at UNGA. So we have events, especially around women and girls that we were speaking about. We'll have events at UNGA that are kind of interconnected. One thing I did want to mention is we have these employee resource groups supporting women, supporting all sorts of different interests and areas of employees at the company. And we have one that's going to be organized with our next generation leaders and our women leaders around climate, where we're going to be hearing from folks on innovation in the climate space. So that's one exciting thing that's coming up.
Very exciting. Thank you, Rachel. I did want to ask Rachel as a follow-up, since I was thinking back to your journey. You said you spoke or that you worked at McDonald's for, I guess, 8 years. Is that what you said? So almost a decade.
Yeah.
And then you've been at ELC. I would love to hear from your viewpoint, working at two very large multinational corporations, like how the sustainability, specifically from a climate, how that work has changed over the last, I don't know, decade, 15 years. You know, have businesses showed up in a bigger way now based on the work they're seeing from big companies like McDonald's and ELC? I would just love to hear that perspective.
Yeah. It's a big question. I mean, it has changed dramatically. I would say what Shri was talking about in terms of leadership support is something that's so important and has really changed. CEOs are talking to each other. Big firms like BlackRock are talking to CEOs and pushing them to do more on sustainability, and consumers are pushing. So one thing I thought before going to McDonald's was I was very skeptical about the voting with your dollar perspective. And after being at McDonald's, I realized how that makes a huge difference. So when when the purchasing decisions you make and the kind of feedback that you give to companies, they are listening to that. And then younger generations pushing for change, it is changing these big corporations. So I would say that there's kind of this momentum because of regulation, investors, consumers, employees saying, you know, we won't work for you if you don't take action in these areas. And one thing that has helped a lot is having standards. So those goals that I mentioned earlier, basically a group of NGOs came together and said, if companies want to take action and you want it to be meaningful, this is what you need to do. And they keep raising the bar on what that looks like so that it can be transparent. Companies can't hide behind, you know, fluffy language. It's measurable, it's actionable. So I think we're making real progress. Obviously, we're not there. We have way more to do, but I am optimistic about everything. I think, you know, the final thing I'll say is the solutions are there. We know how to get this work done. It isn't theoretical or magical. We know what the solutions are. Now we need to get companies to step in and do the work.
That's a good point. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, we have time. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but we have time for one more. So Victoria asks, as a leader in the cosmetic space, how does ELC balance providing consumers with shade ranges that cater to a variety of skin tones while being mindful of overproduction and waste? Is that something that the ESG team has any influence on? That's a good question.
Well, I can say that we have a big program on excess waste. So it's a big area because it has carbon emissions from producing too much product, from shipping too much product, and we want to reduce those emissions. It's also very expensive for the company to be producing more inventory than we use. But then there's this balance of meeting consumers' needs, right? And being there with the consumer and having flexibility and many options, and also our many brands like we've been talking about. So some of it is just a business optimization, like inventory management. We also do some really cool work with product donation. I don't know, Esha, I know that's not quite in your world, but your team does a lot of great work to say, we're not just putting this stuff in the garbage, we're actually providing it to people who may use it.
Yeah, I'll
So
just jump in
Yeah,
to
please.
say on the product donation piece, which isn't quite what I do, but as Rachel said, some members of my team are really focused on product donations, and we are putting together a more comprehensive plan, working with many different players across the business and enterprise to ensure that we are doing what we can to make sure that we are reducing waste in every way, and through our product donations as well.
Amazing. Okay, I think we're going to sneak in one more question before we wrap up. So this question from Q&A is, how is ELC thinking about expanding the racial equity initiative in other countries? So what does it look like in places like South Africa, India, places like that?
I'll take that one. So for now, a lot of the direct racial equity work that we are doing, as I mentioned, is focused on the US. However, we do fold equity into all of the partnerships that we have. And so our work internationally is really through some of our education and communities partnerships. So for instance, we support a fellowship program in the Amazon to support Indigenous women who are working on conservation efforts there. And so obviously that is another form of supporting racial equity internationally. And so as the foundation continues to expand, and as we continue to look in the future, one thing that our team is really focused on is working with regional leads across all of the regions where our brands are located to really think through partnerships that make sense to them and having them really drive a lot of the conversations, and it not being come from, you know, this office in New York, but really partner with the regions. And so I really see our racial equity work as moving in that direction too, as the portfolio expands.
That's great. Thank you, Asha. Shri?
The other thing, I'll just jump in. I know there's another question regarding packaging and our actual commitments to it. So, and not to plug the product that I work on the most, but we have our social impact and sustainability report that we put out. And I'm happy to send that link over, but in that kind of lists out, we're very transparent and clear about not only our goals across social impact and sustainability or environmental initiatives, but also our racial equity and gender equity work that goes on. So there's a lot of information around our goals and commitments there as well.
Yeah, how could we forget to plug the SINS report? It's like the basis for all this. Thanks, Shri. Appreciate that. Okay, well, thank you all. We're going, in the interest of time, I know we only have 8 minutes. So we're going to circle back to that poll question that we asked you all at the beginning of the conversation to see if your knowledge of ESG has improved. I'm sure that it has. I know mine has since we started this conversation. So you're going to see the same poll question pop up on your screen. And that is, how familiar do you feel now with ELC's environmental, social, and governance initiatives from 1 through 5? So we'll give you guys a couple seconds to answer that. Okay. I think that's enough time. Oh, the results. Okay. Oh, did it go away? I think it went away on my end. Okay, there it is. Lots of 4s and 5s, which is great. It's exactly what we want. And I'm sure Shri, Rachel, Asha, they are open to any questions any of you have about the work we're doing in ESG going forward. So if any of you have any questions, definitely reach out to them. And lastly, we're going as promised. We would like to open up the floor for our raffle portion for some wonderful, responsibly sourced, responsibly packaged ELC products. And so we'll share that portion. Okay, so first question. ELC's Charitable Foundation represents one way we drive social impact and support partners across the world. What are the pillars of the foundation? Asha talked about this. Okay, lots of D's. Okay, I think we can go to the answer now. It's D. It's all of the above: women and girls, communities, and racial equity. Wonderful. Okay, next question. When did ELC launch the first iteration of what's now the Social Impact and Sustainability Report? 1997, 2005, 2009, or 2016? We're getting a lot of different answers on this one. Give me a few more seconds. Okay, I think we can move on to the answer. C, 2009. And that's the work Shri does. Shri, you haven't been here since 2009, have you?
I definitely have not. I wish the answer was 1997. That was cool to be a real pioneer in this space. But
Yes, seriously. Okay, next question. Prior to ELC's partnership with Howard University for She's Howard Own Your Power program, what was our first partnership program that helped to expose HU Business School freshmen to brands such as MAC and Aveda to drive portfolio building projects? A, Pretty Powerful program, B, 21 CAP, C, Let's Talk Beauty, or D, Business of Beauty 101. All gradients, by the way. Okay. Okay, and the answer is B, 21 CAP. Okay. And I believe that's our last question. Okay, so the winners of the raffle will be reached out to by our team, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Candace Harris, who's going to close us out.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. I'm over here in Los Angeles, so still afternoon for me. So I'm Dr. Candace Harris, president of the Howard University Alumni Association, and what a wonderful panel and panelists. Again, we just want to thank you for attending, and we want to make sure that you look out for communication for the next She's Howard program, and make sure that you scan to complete the focus group survey, and first five to complete will win a product from ELC. So thank you everyone for coming, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.